Hello comrades, it's TheFinnishBolshevik. Today I'm gonna be reacting and critiquing a video by Ted Ed called History versus Vladimir Lenin. Isn't that the really terrible Che Guevara video? Let's hope that this Lenin video isn't as terrible as that one, but we'll give it a shot.
He was one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. But was he a hero who toppled an oppressive tyranny?
Yes. The end.
Or a villain who replaced it with another?
Ooh, a villain.
Your Honor, this is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov.
This is like, no offense, but this format, like the trial thing, to me it's just kind of silly and stupid, and this dude's voice is so annoying, like already. Maybe I've just been conditioned in a Pavlovian way to like find all these anti-communist propaganda videos inherently annoying before I even start watching properly.
The rabble-rouser who helped overthrow the Russian Tsar Nicholas II in
The rabble-rouser?
1917 and founded the Soviet Union, one of the worst dictatorships of the 20th century.
Oh no, man, here we go. One of the worst dictatorships of the 20th century. Like, give me a
Oh. The Tsar,
What the hell is this accent? Holy...
under whom the masses toiled in slavery.
Why? Why does he have to have an accent like this? He's correct, what he's saying is factually true. The Tsar was a bloody tyrant under who the masses toiled in slavery, but it just sounds like a joke with an accent like that. Honestly, it's kind of racist. Like, why?
This is rubbish. Serfdom had already been abolished in 1861.
Yeah, serfdom was abolished in 1861. Just like in America, there's absolutely no oppression of any racial minorities, despite the fact that slavery has already been abolished.
And replaced by something worse. The factory bosses treated the people far worse than their former feudal landlords.
Possibly, but that's a bit irrelevant because most people did not work in factories. But yeah, in the countryside, serfdom was abolished, but people still continued to suffer under the rule of landlords and capitalists. Just like in the US, how former slaves continued to be like sharecroppers under their previous slave master and whatnot.
Russian workers toiled for 11 hours a day.
That is true, sometimes even longer.
But Tsar Nicholas made laws to protect the workers.
The same kind of laws that they had in England during the Industrial Revolution, like, oh, we have factory inspectors to inspect and make sure that the conditions of the child laborers who work for 12 hours a day are not too harsh. And of course, all those inspectors were like completely corrupt, had absolutely no effect. The capitalists had a million ways of oppressing the people. Did you know that in those times, if the worker was like 2 minutes late, or if the worker made some kind of mistake, or whatever excuse there was, the capitalist would impose fines on him, and those would be deducted from his wages. And because the capitalists were basically all-powerful, they could just lie and wrongfully impose all kinds of fines on you all the time. Even if you didn't do anything wrong, they would just impose all these fines on you and deduct money from your wages, which were low to begin with. Some of Lenin's earliest works talk about fines in factories.
Remember what happened in 1905 after his troops fired on peaceful petitioners?
The only inaccurate thing about this picture is that the priest at the front wasn't shot. The workers were shot, but the priest wasn't. Because the priest, named Gapan, was actually an agent of the Tsarist secret police called the Okhrana, and it is alleged that he deliberately lured the workers into this procession to be shot. And this is because at the time, many of the big worker organizations were called Zubatov worker organizations. They looked like genuine, spontaneous workers' organizations, but they were actually created by the secret police as provocations to basically lure and trap class-conscious and organized workers into these groups so that the police could then get them. Although Lenin said that kind of backfired on the government because even though they were controlled by the police, they still only increased the level of class consciousness and the level of worker organization. A very similar thing happened in Finland because here also the first workers' organizations were started by capitalists, mainly Julius von Fricht, who created the first worker organization in the country so that he could control it and so that the workers wouldn't be able to start their own.
And the Tsar ended the rebellion by introducing a constitution and an elected parliament, the Duma, while retaining absolute power and dissolving them whenever he wanted. Perhaps there would would have been more reforms in due time if radicals like Lenin weren't always stirring up trouble.
Oh yeah, that always works. If you just say like, no, we're fine, like, we'll just wait, we don't push for any change, that's always how change happens, right?
Your Honor, maybe Nicholas II did doom himself with bad decisions, but Lenin deserves no credit for this. When the February 1917 uprisings finally forced the Tsar to abdicate, Lenin was still exiled in Switzerland. So who came to power? The Duma formed a provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky, an incompetent bourgeois failure. He even launched another failed offensive in the war, where Russia had already lost so much, instead of ending it like the people wanted.
That is true.
It was a constitutional social democratic government, the most progressive of its time.
That is technically true. It was, the most progressive of its time. It was a constitutional government with social democrats in it. The government consisted of liberal capitalists, Menshevik social democrats, and demagogic populist socialists and social reformers known as the Social Revolutionary Party, and other similar parties but more right-wing, such as the Trudoviks, which is where Alexander Kerensky was from. But saying it was the most progressive of its time, that's not saying a whole lot, because it only means that it was one of the first European countries to be a republic. The government was no longer a feudal government, but it was a bourgeois government, and it was supporting capitalists. That's why they stayed in the war, that's why they didn't fix any of the social problems. They didn't nationalize the banks or nationalize the industries or implement strict economic controls, which would have been necessary to prevent the economic chaos. Why didn't they do that? Well, of course, because the capitalists and bankers wouldn't like it. They didn't implement land reform because the landlords wouldn't like it, and they didn't stop the war because the imperialist capitalists and also their imperialist allies wouldn't like it. The Kerensky government was incredibly bankrupt, they had a ton of debt, and they needed more loans from their allies, and they thought that they couldn't survive without these loans, and that's why they stayed in the war. So they never actually implemented any policies that the people wanted. Instead, they literally continued all the policies of the Tsar.
And it could have succeeded eventually if Lenin hadn't returned in April, sent by the Germans to undermine the Russian war effort and instigate riots.
This is also such a misrepresentation, because he had to negotiate with the Germans for them to even allow him to pass through the country. And they would only let that happen if he was literally in a sealed container and he couldn't get out. Just like various other revolutionaries, such as Alexandra Kollontai, for instance, she wanted to return to Russia, and she had to go through Sweden, but she had been deported from Sweden and she wasn't allowed to be there, so she also had to negotiate with the government for them to allow her to even go through Swedish territory.
The July days were a spontaneous and justified reaction against the government's failures. And Kerensky showed his true colors when he blamed Lenin and arrested and outlawed his Bolshevik party.
Yeah, that's true. There was a spontaneous revolt or spontaneous demonstration which turned violent called the July Days. And the Bolsheviks actually saw that the people were in a very revolutionary mood, but they thought that they're not strong enough yet, that this isn't the time, that if they try to do a revolution now, it will fail. But it became clear to them that they couldn't prevent it, that the people would demonstrate, and that they would demonstrate with arms. So then the Bolsheviks thought that they can't abandon the masses, that it would be irresponsible. So then they still tried to maintain order and discipline in the demonstration and try to steer the demonstration. But the Bolsheviks actually did not cause it. What did Kerensky do? He brought special reactionary soldiers and told them to fire upon the demonstrators with machine guns. Imagine if there was a government claiming to be some kind of liberal, social democratic, progressive government, and then they just fire upon demonstrators with machine guns. The Tsar orders his soldiers to fire upon the peaceful demonstrators. Now, a decade later, Kerensky does the exact same thing. But, of course, Kerensky needed a scapegoat, so he said, no, it's all actually just the Bolsheviks' fault, and then he banned the Bolshevik party. So there were a couple of months where workers' parties could legally function and had freedom of speech and could print their newspapers and stuff, but immediately it was taken away. Far-right thugs smashed the Bolshevik party offices, smashed the Bolshevik printing presses, Lenin had to go into hiding, all that stuff.
It's a good thing the government collapsed under their own incompetence and greed when they tried to stage a military coup, then had to ask the Bolsheviks for help when it backfired. After that, all Lenin had to do was return in October and take charge.
Yeah, so the capitalists thought that Kerensky is incompetent, that this attempt at some kind of liberal reform clearly isn't working, so they need to implement far-right military dictatorship. So they brought this monarchist general named Kornilov, who was supposed to carry out a military coup against Kerensky, although it was actually in agreement with Kerensky. But it didn't work because the Red Guards and the workers' councils prevented the coup from happening. They protected the city of Petrograd, and also because the railroad workers went on strike and refused to transport Kornilov's troops. And after the Kornilov affair, Kerensky was really screwed, because now the Red Guards were like all over. They had successfully armed themselves and prevented this coup, and now they were really the masters of the situation, and Kerensky no longer had means of maintaining power.
The government was peacefully overthrown overnight.
Yeah, the government was peacefully overthrown. Already early the next year, there were attempts at white counter-revolution. The capitalists tried to start a civil war. It was easily stopped by worker militias. However, after all the foreign powers, including France, UK, Japan, the United States, Czechoslovakia, when they all invaded Soviet Russia and started propping up various white generals such as Yudenich, Denikin, Wrangel, and those others, that's when the civil war kicked off. But again, the Bolsheviks didn't do that, the capitalists did that. The level of atrocity and the depths that the capitalists will stoop to is insane. They had absolutely no justification for invading Soviet Russia. I mean, okay, Soviet Russia had ended its participation in the imperialist world war, which you might think that people would consider a good thing, because it was a good thing, because it contributed to world peace. But the Tsarist government and the Kerensky government, they were supposed to continue their participation in the war on the side of the United States and the Entente powers. Hence why they invade and then try to restore the power of the Tsar. These various other countries like Japan and Romania and Poland and whatnot, they only invaded because they just wanted to steal some territory, which they did. Romania took Bessarabia, Germany conquered Ukraine, Poland took part of western Ukraine and part of western Belarusia, and even Finland wanted to take Karelia, although it failed, and Japan also wanted to take Sakhalin and Primorye and various other territories.
How many people did they execute without trial? And was it really necessary to murder the Tsar's entire family? Lenin may not have given the order.
Perhaps it wouldn't have been necessary to kill the entire Romanov dynasty, but this was during the Civil War, when all those major Western powers had invaded, and they literally were trying to restore the Tsar and restore the dynasty, and the Tsar's family were kept imprisoned, I think, in Ryazan, and if I remember correctly, Ryazan was being besieged by white forces, and they were, like, surrounded. So the Revolutionary Military Committee, who kept the Tsar's family under arrest, panicked because they thought that, oh damn, the whites are gonna rescue the Tsar's family, so then they panicked and killed them. But nobody has ever been able to prove that Lenin even gave the order, and nobody really knows exactly who ordered it or who even did it. The Revolutionary Military Committee consisted of various people, not only Bolsheviks, but also left SRs and anarchists, so nobody really knows who did that. But I mean, I would still chalk that up to the shit happens category. Like, could the Tsar really expect that that wouldn't happen?
But it was not only imperialists that the Bolsheviks killed. What about the purges and executions of other socialist and anarchist parties, their old allies?
Right. This anti-communist propaganda always paints this picture where the Bolsheviks just killed people for no reason, and they just did all these bad things, and they just turned on their old allies who were just these good guys who didn't do anything wrong and didn't do anything to bring this upon themselves. The anarchists were extremely unreliable allies. They killed communists all the time, especially if we're talking about like the Makhno bandits in Ukraine. But if we exclude them because they're kind of a category unto themselves, if we just talk about regular anarchists elsewhere, like the Bakuninists, they were literal terrorists. Their main mode of activity was assassinations, bomb attacks. Some of them, like the sailors in the Navy, they just joined the communists because they were more communist material than anarchist material. So, because most of the organized anarchists and most of the soldier and worker anarchists just joined the Bolsheviks instead, or joined the Red Army or the Red Guard, there was actually even a Russian anarchist sailor detachment fighting on the side of the Finnish Reds in the Finnish Civil War. They just joined the Reds. Then all the anarchists that you had left were the ones who refused to join the Reds. Hardcore Bakuninists, terrorists, people who supported Kropotkin, people who were not consistent socialists by any means. Like Kropotkin, he didn't even oppose World War I. He was totally confused. He was hanging out with Mensheviks, he was hanging out with anti-communists, he didn't know what to do. He didn't even take a consistently anti-war, a consistently anti-imperialist line, and neither did the anarchists. But by the time that there were any kind of actions against the anarchists, they did not constitute any kind of significant organization. They were just individuals or small circles of guys. Really, the big group that the Bolsheviks had to go after was the left SRs. The left SRs had been a partner of the Bolsheviks, although they were a much smaller group. They had a much smaller representation in the government. They had much less power. They were a split from the party which had been in the Kerensky government, called the Social Revolutionary Party. The left SRs split from it because they wanted some kind of socialism, but they were really utopians, and they were based on petty bourgeois people in the countryside and in the cities, so they were mostly supported by artisans and small business owners and shopkeepers, as well as like middle-sized farmers, and not by workers, and their method of implementing political change also was terrorism. So the SR party actually split so that the right SRs did use terrorism sometimes, but they were more reformists, whereas the left SRs were not reformists. Instead, they were insurrectionists and they favored terrorism. Some of their policies were implemented, like the agrarian program of the government was done jointly by the Bolsheviks and the left SRs, but they really had a falling out because of the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, because the Bolsheviks wanted to end the war, they wanted to make a peace treaty with Germany, and Lenin explained that it was necessary to do this because their army had completely crumbled. They couldn't even defend themselves. This was before the Red Army was created. The left SRs didn't want to sign the peace, but because the Bolsheviks signed the peace, the left SRs started a mutiny against the Bolsheviks. They tried to carry out a putsch in Moscow, and because they were keen on assassinations and terroristic attacks, they launched an assassination against the German ambassador named Murbach, and they killed him, and this was an attempt to sabotage the peace treaty, because they thought if we assassinate the German ambassador, that's gonna make the German government mad, and then they won't sign the peace. And then they also tried to assassinate Lenin, and the assassin shot Lenin in the neck, but Lenin did not die. After that, the left SR party was smashed. It split into 3 different factions: the Revolutionary Communists, the Narodnik Communists, and the left SRs. The left SRs were smashed. The Revolutionary Communists and Narodnik Communists joined the Bolshevik Party instead.
What about the Tambov Rebellion, where peasants resisting grain confiscation were killed with poison gas?
So this is a total myth. So in Tambov, there was an uprising of well-to-do and rich peasants. Poison gas was a weapon that was still used worldwide at the time, and it was generally discussed if they should develop poison gas and develop facilities for producing poison gas, but they didn't actually use it. I really should make a whole separate video on the Tambov Rebellion, but I need some more time to read more books about it.
Or sending the army to crush the workers in Kronstadt, who were demanding democratic self-management.
Yeah, so I have a separate video about the Kronstadt mutiny called The Truth About the Kronstadt Uprising. I'll put that in the description, where I explain in great detail what it was actually about, because the idea that it was some kind of uprising of the workers who wanted democratic self-management is just false on so many levels. Many people think that the Kronstadt uprising was some kind of anarchist movement, but even that is completely false. It was not any kind of workers' movement at all.
What good came of this socialist order? Even after the Civil War was won, there were famines, repression.
Yeah, so what happened? Literacy increased from around 20% to 100%. Life expectancy doubled. People got electricity, they got culture, they got access to healthcare for the first time in their lives. Homelessness was abolished, unemployment was abolished, there was an 8-hour working day, or in some cases a 7-hour or even a 6-hour working day, retirement at age 50 or age 55, fastest industrial development, fastest economic development, certainly fastest cultural development, just the whole country transformed in one generation, the biggest advance in human history. All the different nationalities finally had their own autonomous republics and their own autonomous regions. All the different nationalities finally could use their own languages as official languages. They were able to develop their own cultures. There was finally an end to anti-Jewish pogroms and pogroms against other minorities. All the basic problems of the Russian Empire were solved. At the same time in Europe, the other countries had fascist dictatorships. Peasants still lived in semi-feudal conditions. National minorities had absolutely no rights. The most advanced capitalist countries were still blatantly colonialist. They killed millions in the colonies, developed pseudoscientific racial theories about how non-white races were inferior. The US still had racial segregation. In the Soviet Union, men and women had equal rights. And as a result, capitalist countries also had to implement similar things. Capitalist countries also had to give electoral rights to women because the Soviet Union was doing that. Capitalist countries also had to allow women to work in any job. In Finland, it was only after the October Revolution and the Finnish Revolution that women were allowed to control their own property. And it was only in the 1920s that they started to remove restrictions limiting which jobs women were even allowed to get. And they talk about labor camps. Like, labor camps were something inherited from the Russian Empire. And all the major European powers had labor camps until like the late 1950s. And in principle, there's nothing wrong with having prisoners perform work. Usually the prisoners in the Soviet Union received a wage. Many of them worked outside of prison. Even Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he worked for a time in Moscow building apartment buildings while he was in prison. The only problem with the prison camps was that the country was so poor and the conditions were so bad, but that couldn't be helped. The only thing they could do was progress forward. And then, especially during World War II, tons of prisoners died. But again, whose fault is that? That's not the fault of the Soviet government, that's the fault of the Nazis. And the Soviet government was the only government that tried to promote a consistently anti-Nazi, consistently peaceful policy throughout the 1930s. First, they were not even allowed into the League of Nations. Then once they were finally allowed in, they constantly tried to create peace conferences which would define what an aggressive country is, so that if any fascist country carried out aggression, they could point to that and say, look, that's an aggressive country, now everybody resist them. But the Western powers didn't agree to that. The Soviet government tried to create a collective defense treaty of all the non-aggressive and non-fascist countries against fascist countries, so that if Italy does something, if Germany does something, then all the other countries are going to resist them. But the Western powers never agreed to that. They allowed Japan to attack China. They allowed Italy and Germany to intervene in Spain. They allowed Germany to take Austria, Czechoslovakia. If the Soviet Union wasn't there, if the Soviet Union hadn't gone through all this rapid industrialization, who would have stopped Hitler? But no, it's all terrible.
While Lenin's successor, Stalin, established a cult of personality and absolute power.
Oh yeah, cult of personality and absolute power, that's right. Based on what exactly? Like, let me see. Let's see if there's any sources. View full lesson. What do you mean full lesson? There's nothing here. Yeah, there's nothing here. Well, it's always just BS anyway, but just out of curiosity, I wish that they would list the sources, because I would be interested to see.
That wasn't the plan. Lenin never cared for personal gains. Even his enemies admitted that he fully believed in his cause, living modestly and working tirelessly.
Of course that's true. I mean, he literally devoted his whole life, working day and night, literally dying from exhaustion at a very young age. But the implication here is that somehow Stalin supposedly just cared for personal gain or something. No, he also worked his whole life tirelessly, risking his life in an illegal underground revolutionary movement, being put in prison several times. And people also say the same thing about Stalin, how he lived modestly, worked tirelessly, which they both, of course, did.
He saw how power-hungry Stalin was and tried to warn the party.
Yeah, this is so absurd. Like, Stalin was co-opted into the Central Committee in 1913 because in 1912 they had the Prague Conference of the Bolshevik Party, which was when the Bolshevik Party definitively emerged as a separate party from the Mensheviks. But Stalin couldn't be there because he was in prison. So on Lenin's suggestion, he was taken into the Central Committee. Lenin then asked Stalin to draft the party's official position on national minorities, which he did, which Lenin then praised highly. Stalin was made the editor of the party newspaper Pravda. After the February Revolution, Stalin got out of prison, went to Petrograd, became the head of the party newspaper, and became the head of the party in Russia while Lenin was in exile. He controlled the newspaper together with Kamenev, and Kamenev advocated a political line that was against Lenin, while Stalin advocated a political line that was in support of Lenin. Stalin headed the party congress in August 1917, the 6th Party Congress, which accepted Trotsky's party to join into the Bolshevik Party and took the definitive decision that they would carry out a revolution against the Kerensky government. After the October Revolution takes place, Lenin proposes that Stalin should be in control of two people's commissariats, the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection and the Commissariat of Nationalities. Nobody else had two commissariats. And then Lenin proposes that Stalin should become the general secretary of the party, effectively controlling the party while Lenin himself becomes head of state. And at the same time, Lenin is constantly criticizing all the other leaders of the party. So Bukharin is embroiled in the Brest-Litovsk controversy, goes into opposition. Of course, he had always had major disagreements and major arguments with Lenin in the past as well. Zinoviev and Kamenev opposed the October Revolution. They have major issues with Lenin. Lenin criticizes them. Trotsky obviously had always been against Lenin. He's also against Lenin on the Brest-Litovsk issue. Then in the 1920s, trade union debate, one of the last major debates that Lenin participated in, he is against Trotsky and Bukharin and supported by Stalin. Before Lenin is even dead, Trotsky starts to organize the left opposition. But then these anti-communists say, oh, actually, Lenin was against Stalin and he was on the side of all those other guys. Lenin actually thought that Stalin was bad. On what basis? Of course, because there is the supposed Lenin's testament, which several historians now have openly stated that they consider a forgery. I have a whole separate video on the forgery of the supposed testament of Lenin. I'll also link that in the description.
And the decades of totalitarianism that followed after? You can call it that. But it was Lenin's efforts that changed Russia in a few decades from a backward and undeveloped monarchy full of illiterate peasants to a modern, industrial superpower with one of the world's best educated populations, unprecedented opportunities for women, and some of the most important scientific advancements of the century.
That is true.
Nearly everyone had a roof over their head and food on their plate, which few countries have achieved.
That is true. Even today, in the most developed capitalist countries, they have hunger, homelessness, unemployment, massive social issues, continuous economic crisis, continuous wars.
But these advances could still have happened even without Lenin and the repressive regime he established.
I always love this argument. Like, how exactly? So, okay, paint me a picture here, how Kerensky gets overthrown by Kornilov or some other military despot. They immediately restore the monarchy. Let's imagine that somehow that doesn't happen. Let's imagine that somehow they remain a, they become some kind of social democratic welfare state. Like, give me a break. That wouldn't have happened. The country is way too economically and culturally underdeveloped. The Orthodox Church still had so much power over people and over the government. The aristocracy still had so much power over the government. All these Kerensky apologists always say that, oh, they had such good growth. Yeah, all these countries that were starting to emerge into capitalism for the first time, they all had relatively good growth compared to the past for a short time, but then it stagnated again. And their growth was still like so slow that they would have never survived the Nazi invasion. The Russian Empire had fallen so much behind, and they had gotten their ass handed to them ever since the mid-1800s. Crimean War, war with Japan, First World War, the Russian Empire was falling apart. I mean, it's very possible that the whole country could have even splintered. And what little industry they had was controlled by foreign companies, and they were in massive debt to the West. There's actually a book called From Farm to Factory, which attempts to calculate using computer models how Russia would have developed economically if it had followed different paths. And that book concludes that the industrialization of the 5-year plans under the leadership of Stalin were economically tremendously successful, although it claims that collectivization of agriculture was not successful, but that's actually based on a fundamental misunderstanding. I'll have to leave that for a separate video. I really want to do an analysis of that book someday, hopefully pretty soon. But as far as this video goes, it's not quite as terrible as some other ones, but it has that annoying fake neutrality, fake objectivity. These people think that the truth is always somewhere in the middle, so okay, colonialism versus no colonialism. Well, maybe we'll just have a little bit of colonialism. Maybe that's the solution. Okay, Nazism versus anti-Nazism. Well, maybe it's somewhere in the middle. Like, no, see how that doesn't actually make any sense? So they think, maybe the Tsar was bad, but Lenin was also bad. No. It's not actually being truthful or objective. It's actually just liberal capitalist bias, and it's dishonest.